The world is a very unequal place, and one that appears to be heading unstoppably towards multiple crises. Climate change, war, growing wealth inequality, and increasing political polarization can all seem like they're inevitable. But a new report, unveiled today at the World Inequality Forum in Paris, takes a very different view. The Global Justice Report is the work of teams of academics attached to the World Inequality Lab, co directed by economist Thomas Piketty. And it sets out not just a vision, but a plan for how to achieve two vital goals, often thought to be at odds: economic prosperity and equality with planetary habitability. It's ambitious, not least of all because it requires cooperation on a global scale, but it's also practical, pitching concrete policies across a range of areas, including industrial strategy, diet and agriculture, wealth taxes, and working hours, and has a remarkable conclusion. Based on historical social achievements and emerging energy technologies, it argues that by the end of the century, the majority of the globe could work substantially less and earn substantially more, all while keeping global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. This is from the report. Per capita monthly national income converges to €5,000 in every country, closing a 16-fold gap. The share of the bottom half of global wealth increases from 2% to 30%, while the share of the billionaire class decreases from 6% to 0.05%. Nearly 90% of the world's population double their income while working roughly half as many hours as they do today. Warming reaches 1.8 degrees C by 2100, rather than over 4 degrees C under baseline macroeconomic and policy trends. Sounds great, right? But I can already hear you asking, how on earth do you square this circle? Well, Thomas Piketty explains.
Is this possible, and under what conditions this is possible? This requires a transformation of what we mean by prosperity and economic activity. In order to reach this transformation, we need a very deep transformation of the international economic order, which today is very much a plutocratic order with a concentration of power and voting rights among the richest country in the world, and which in our view is not sustainable. We need to set up a global justice fund. So the global justice fund will collect money from a global wealth tax on billionaires and centimillionaires and a global income tax on the top income earners of the world. And then this money in the global justice fund will be used first to pay country dividends. So each country would receive the same amount per capita of the order of €1,000 per capita in the coming decades. The other use of the money of the global justice fund is to put some of the resources into a world sovereign fund. So it's a little bit like the Norwegian sovereign fund, except that the Norwegian sovereign fund got its money from fossil fuel extraction, which is maybe not the best way to get money. So we prefer to get the resources from the global wealth tax on billionaires and centimillionaires, which in effect will transfer some of their shares to the fund. So, if you have a 2% wealth tax or a 5% wealth tax or a 10% wealth tax to pay, you will transfer 2% or 5% or 10% of your portfolio to the sovereign fund. Now, the sovereign fund could just keep the same portfolio, but of course, over a few years, the objective is that the sovereign fund will be able to redirect investment in a way that's more in line with our sustainability objective. So maybe, less data centers everywhere and a bit more wind turbines and more sustainable investment.
Enacting economic policies to promote ownership equality may make the world less unfair, but how does it fit in with preventing climate change? For that, the authors introduce a central concept: sufficiency. Here's how the report explains it. To avoid climate catastrophes, we show that the sufficiency is required: a structural transformation of the economy involving shorter working hours, a lower material footprint, a shift from material-intensive sectors towards relatively immaterial sectors, such as education and health, and major changes in food systems and land use. Rapid decarbonization of energy systems is also necessary, as is the sharp compression of income and wealth inequality. This compression is both a social justice objective and a condition for financing necessary climate investment and human capital expenditure, and for sustaining political support from the bottom and middle income classes in both the North and indeed the South. The report argues that working less is an imperative to keep climate change below 2%. In fact, we'd need to halve it from an average of 2,100 hours per year to just 1,000 hours. The report also requires that we change the work we do. This graphic shows the number of global economic labor hours by sector since 1800. According to the report, moving away from extractive manufacturing and food production industries, which have anyway become less consuming of work hours over time anyway, to sectors with less of an impact like health, education, and public services will also be a necessity. Other changes will include eating less red meat to reverse deforestation. Now, there's plenty in this report that will seem unimaginable. A global currency, for one thing, emerging from a global financial institution, as well as a global wealth tax. There's also the idea that by changing consumption and production patterns, we can achieve equality while avoiding both degrowth and ever increasing productivity. That would involve a huge psychological shift, one that, as the report points out, doesn't define happiness in purely economic terms. But for Piketty, the alternatives are all too imaginable and nightmarish. He told The Guardian this: people realize this is simply not working. If the billionaires and the centimillionaires of the world were conducting our economy, investing the money in a way that brings us to a fantastic future with planetary habitability, rising wages and better housing conditions and health conditions for all, then everybody would be happy to give them the keys. But that's not what we see. Their new dream is to cover the entire planet with data centers. This is their economic project for the world. But everybody can see that this is just going to increase the material footprint of our economy. That is this going to make global warming even worse. The authors are clear that they don't expect governments to take up their ideas anytime soon. Rather, their aim is to show that our problems are resolvable, if there's the political will, with economic anthropologist Jason Hickel saying this about the report. It's an important and timely intervention. All of this is technically feasible to achieve. We have good lives for all within planetary boundaries, but it will require organized political struggle to make it happen. It may be that it will take future crises to create either the necessary political will or the organized struggle needed to follow this technical blueprint, with Piketty saying this: there'll be crises. I think that's for sure. People need to get accustomed to the fact that big change will happen in any case. We're not in a situation where things can just continue as they are forever. Dale, does this report give you more optimism for the future, for a fully automated luxury communist future?
I mean, it's difficult because on the one hand, it feels like, wow, the things that would make this world actually habitable feel so far away from the reality that we currently exist in that it's like, how could we even get there? But at the same time, I'm very grateful for this report. And that's because of, this famous quote by Milton Friedman, where he says, in times of crisis or perceived crisis, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. And so we need to throw a couple ideas to be lying around when the inevitable crisis comes. And, obviously Milton Friedman was a core architect of neoliberalism, the economic system that we've been living under for the past, 50 years. And he said this in the context of, at the time, wanting to roll back the post-war consensus, which at the time, the post-war consensus felt very entrenched and very impossible to reverse. And at the time when Friedman and the Chicago School were kind of promoting these ideas of a free market and the dissolution of the welfare state, that felt like a completely radical, fringe, unworkable idea. But it was during an economic crisis that honestly is going to pale in comparison to the crises that we're going to see as a result of climate breakdown. Because of these artfully arranged political actors, these ideas that seemed fringe and radical were ushered into normality. And so it is possible for, ideas that seem so far away through the context of a crisis and particular political will, can be brought into being. Now, I want to be very clear, the kinds of changes that we're trying to usher into are going to be much harder to usher in than Friedman's were, because Friedman's ideas ultimately were in service of power. He was interested in making the wealthy more wealthy, making the powerful more powerful. It was a project of consolidating wealth and power in the hands of a very small number of already rich and powerful people. Whereas our project is very much about redistributing wealth and power away from a small elite and towards a more fairly distributed economy. So it's going to be much more difficult for us than it will be for Friedman and his colleagues, but it's not impossible. And I think knowing what we have to do is the first step to being able to organize the scale of political will and power to make it happen. Is it like the most likely outcome? No, the most likely outcome is the vision that the already rich and powerful have, which is, data centers everywhere, harsh borders everywhere, and, large sways of abandonment of the majority of the world's population. But it's not impossible. And so long as it's not impossible, it's worth fighting for.
100%. The fight will never, ever stop. Just want to go to one of your comments just before we finish the show today. Thank you, Frank V, for the $4.99. The police treat the oppressed and exploited worse, but they can abuse their power against anyone. Police are agents of ruling class violence. Very true, as you laid out so eloquently earlier, Dali. Absolutely, absolutely. Very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. Thank you, Dahlia, as well, as always, for joining me on a Thursday.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely the same is true in my direction as well. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.